evening, everyone. Welcome to our joint meetings tonight. I don't know that we've ever had one this elaborate before, but we do have the microphones. We are recording tonight's meeting. It is an open public meeting, so that's what the microphones are on the table for. They're not necessarily for amplification in the room, but for the recording. So American Structure Point is going to use it as well, but it's also really more of an informal conversation. So to get started this evening, if we would all please stand for the pledge, we'll do that. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So this evening's meeting is made up of the City Council, the Plan Commission, and the Board of Zoning Appeals, along with our committee that has been working on the UDO and our comprehensive plan. So at this time, Alan, I think we have quorum for the Board of Zoning Appeals, is that correct? Okay, so we will call that meeting to order. Do we have enough for plan? Plan has quorum? It's in one. Okay, so we'll call that meeting to order as well. And City Council has two. So we don't have quorum on that. We will reflect in the minutes that there isn't quorum for the City Council meeting unless one of the others joins us. So that will, is that all of the bodies? Perfect. Okay. So this is part of the public meeting. With that, I'll turn it over to Matt O'Rourke with American Structure Point. It's the only item on the agenda under new business to talk about our Unified Development Ordinance.
Thank you, Mayor. Welcome everybody this evening. Before we get too much into the presentation, we'll go through and introduce who we are. My name is Matthew O'Rourke. I'm the Planning and Economic Development Group Leader with American Structure Point.
Hi, I'm David Baird. I'm a Senior Project Manager with American Structure Point.
Good evening, I'm KK Gerhard Fritz, and I am not with American Structure Point. I'm a sub-consultant for them and have my own little one-woman shop, the planning workshop.
And I'm Philip Roth. I'm a senior planner with American Structure Point.
Great, thanks everybody. So really what we're here to mainly focus on this evening is the Unified Development Ordinance drafting and where we're at in that process, and starting to enter into the public hearings and the formal adoption as we continue to draft that. Before that, just to introduce ourselves as the team here. We've been working with Greensburg on several projects over the last 2 years. Started with capital improvement plan, worked on a comprehensive plan that was adopted a little less than a year ago at this point, which once you get into that, that's when you start the UDO. So since that time, we've been really working away on taking all the information that was in those previous plans and adopting that into what is now becoming the UDO. So that's what we're here to do tonight. We're really here to kind of go through the history, a little bit of the process of where we're at, and then really launch and do a lot of detail on the UDO, since that is where we're at currently in all those processes. So with that, I will turn it over to Phil Roth, and he's going to give you, as the principal working on that comprehensive plan project, an overview of how we got to this point.
Thanks, Matt. Again, my name is Philip Roth, and why I have been involved on the outskirts of the UDO effort. My primary role has been with the update of the comprehensive plan. Now, under Indiana law, updates of development regulations have to be consistent with a comprehensive plan. So the city sought to update its comprehensive plan prior to initiating the development of the Unified Development Ordinance. So that was an effort that began in early 2021 and lasted roughly 18 months. I won't go into all of the things that we were talking about or that we did throughout that time period. Suffice to say that we did work with the review team that helped us along the way, consisting of representatives from the community, from your plan commission, from your city council. And we finally were able to get that into adoption last fall. Now this plan, next slide please, reflected a lot of public engagement. I don't know if you can see all of the meetings that were on the slide here. These are just interactions with the public at large. We had quite a few meetings, one-on-one or with small groups with stakeholders in the community as well. We really enjoyed our time at the Tree City Fall Festival, as well as the other events. The St. Mary's Festival is where I learned, to my chagrin, that the kids' tent does not allow adults. I wandered in trying to look for adults to talk to, and they kicked me out. I think I'm banned from St. Mary's Church. But at any rate, my point is that we did have a lot of interaction with the public in the development of the plan. Next slide, please. And trying to come up to some assessment of what we wanted Greensburg to look like over the next 20 years. We identified areas where we wanted to see reinvestment, redevelopment within the city. We prioritized areas where we wanted to see new development to the northwest and to the east of the city. And then we came up with large-scale recommendations that we thought would benefit the city to implement the plan moving forward. One of them was the development of the UDO. Another was reinforcing a lot of the initiatives that you already had underway with multimodal transportation, with getting improvements to your surface transportation, and working on integration of streets and multimodal pathways. So what you see on this slide is kind of a compilation of the major recommendations for land use and growth within the city. We did take a look at areas around the city, even though the city does not have a formal extraterritorial jurisdiction, as we call it. We did look to see what was going to happen on the periphery of the city, identified areas that were of strategic interest, and also identified areas where we really wanted to see or focus redevelopment or infill development within inner city neighborhoods. And this is the kind of the backdrop, as it were, for the UDO updates or for the UDO development. I'd be happy to answer questions about the plan, but I think our time is better spent if we simply go straight into discussion of the UDO, and then I can handle any questions about the plan simultaneous to any questions about the UDO later in the presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to KK to talk about the UDO process.
So my name, for those of you who haven't met me, is really KK. It's two initials. You'll remember that tonight because I am from Kokomo. So just an easy way to remember it. Even Mom called me that. So you've heard the term UDO. That means Unified Development Ordinance. And all that is simply is just combining the zoning and the subdivision ordinance into one document. So that's a big thing, making things a little more user-friendly, putting things in one location, sharing some parts of things like having the same definition in the subdivision ordinance for word that you have in the zoning ordinance. Those kind of things are helpful. So that's something that's a trend we've seen in Indiana. Most communities now are going toward this. Instead of updating their zoning and subdivision ordinances separately, they put them in this combined document. And I'm a big fan. I think it does make things easier for the users. So what we're looking for with this one-stop UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, is something that is easier for people to understand. So that, you know, developers, they want to know, they want some assurance. What can we expect? What is required? Just tell me what's required. And then I have an expectation that that's going to happen. And so what we're trying to do is take some of that guesswork out, or some of the gray area that maybe has been in regulations in the past, to make things a little more predictable. This also will make it easier the way we're doing it for just the common everyday person to figure things out. What can I do on my land? And so we are are doing some things to kind of help make it more visually interesting with flow charts for processes, with illustrations, with tables instead of lots of paragraphs of text and so forth. So it is going to be easier to navigate that way. So again, part of the advantage is that we're sharing some parts of both the subdivision and zoning ordinance, which means that they're going to be in sync with each other and not out of sync. Your zoning and subdivision regulations, which is important, and it trips up a lot of communities. The thing to know, if we could go back, the thing to know that's really important is all those months that you spent on the comprehensive plan, that was a policy. That's the biggest policy that your community has. And it sets the direction for your growth as a community in the future. And so this is what we're aspiring to, this is what we want to be, this is where we want to go. And then it helps kind of set up how we get there, but the way that we do this is to actually use ordinances, which are this Unified Development Ordinance, which is an actual enforceable law. So we translate that comprehensive plan, which is policy, into local ordinances to cover zoning and subdivision. And that's what we're working on now. Okay, now you can go on. And this isn't just for the comprehensive plan that we did, by the way, but other plans in your community can also be implemented through these ordinance standards. So that's important for y'all to keep in mind. So as we started out, we had some goals that we wanted to do for your ordinances. The first one is we noticed that there needed to be some updates to make it so you comply with state and federal law and case law. Some of you have been around long enough to remember that we did a very early amendment to your ordinance before we even got into this, that had to do with the Board of Zoning Appeals and how that board functioned and how it worked to bring it into alignment with what the state law requirements were. So we kind of went out and did an early piece of it that we're now folding into the rest of this to get you all aligned with state law. But there's other federal law, like the Supreme Court case law on signs changed many years ago, so we have to take that into account. Every legislative session, there's something here in Indiana that changes a little bit, and we have to tweak that. So we're trying to get you all lined up with all the current laws and doing that. The other thing we're looking at is something we call best practices. And what are best practices? It's pretty much what it sounds like, where we are saying, okay, here are some emerging things that we're seeing that have worked well with technology or road construction or housing or things like that. And it could be things that we've seen in other Indiana communities, could be things that have been proven time and time again on the national level, but we want to give your community the option to do that. A good example of best practices, if you think about parking lots, years ago they were just big slabs of asphalt. And so you had a lot of runoff from those parking lots. And that runoff had to be treated in your local drainage system. Now there are other ways to look at that, and you can do things like green drainage, options where you can take some of that runoff into your parking lot, then there's less runoff for the city to deal with. Those kind of things are best practices that evolve over time. So we're looking at those too. Of course, after you all spent all the blood, sweat, and tears on the new comprehensive plan, we're going to do all we can to fold those recommendations into your new ordinance and find a way to make those work. And it's not always the same. What works in one community doesn't necessarily work in another. So a lot of these, we kind of look at options and say, what's the best option to implement this part of the plan in your community here in Greensburg. As I already said, it was really important to us that we make it more user-friendly. Less paragraphs of written text, more illustrations, more charts, things like that, more cross-referencing. One of the things Sarah and I talked about was cross-references to Indiana code and the importance of those, just things like that. And we talked about needing more graphics, more labels. One of the other things that changed is new land uses. Sarah, how old is your ordinance that you have now?
About around 2000, I believe. Isn't that right, Ron?
I believe it was adopted in 2000.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you think back to where you were and what you were doing that long ago, you can realize that things change with time, and land uses are one of those things. So those kind of uses are evolving all the time, and we have to look at that and kind of recognize those changes. We don't need a millinery shop anymore, right? But we probably need to address personal solar energy and things like that. And then we also said we need to take a look at what your peer communities are doing and let you know where you are on that. And then see how you compare to your peers. We're not going to tell you who your peers are. We had discussions with staff to kind of figure out what other communities in Indiana to look at when we wanted to compare regulations. But that's kind of important as you look around and say, what's everybody else doing? Do we want to be at the top of that, the bottom of that, somewhere in between? And who are we comparing ourselves to? So we did a great deal of that. We did a lot of research on here's what other communities do that we considered along the way. Okay, now next slide. So again, some of the issues that we saw on the zoning side of things, we had the future land use map that Phil showed us, and that future land use map had categories that you noticed. There were residential categories, there were commercial categories, etc. And so we're trying to take that and translate that into zoning districts in your new ordinance to make sure that we sync what you want to do in your comprehensive plan and that there's a way to do it with your local zoning ordinance. We don't want to end up in a situation where your comprehensive plan recommends something, but there's no way to do it with your regulations. So we're trying to make sure that we do that. Very interested in supporting infill development and redevelopment and investment. So one of the things that we're sensitive to is that a lot of times older neighborhoods or your core neighborhoods were built when standards were different. Lot sizes may be smaller, there may be alleys with garages you enter off that alley. Things are different than new subdivisions. And so we want to make sure that those neighborhoods are able to be maintained and updated without trying to impose new subdivision standards on them. So we're looking at ways to make it easier to replace that garage in that old neighborhood without having to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and things like that. We also are looking at, I think I mentioned an example of the sustainable practice with the parking lot, but things like that are important to us. Looking at transitioning land uses, particularly where you've got the heavier uses like commercial or industrial adjacent to residential uses. That's something you already have in some places in this community. Is that something you want to keep allowing in the future? If so, under what circumstances and what can we do? Maybe some buffers and things like that that we can build into those separations between the uses. One of the other things we looked at was a question of what do we do with manufactured homes and mobile homes? We know that's an affordable type of housing for a lot of people, but there do need to be some standards. And we were just talking about this, I think last week again. We need to set up standards for that in your community to regulate how those happened, so that you can kind of work on the quality of housing that you get in those places. Very interested in trying to protect your downtown historic district. That kind of is similar to what I was talking about with the older core neighborhoods, and trying to make sure that we make it easy to do infill that matches what's there, that kind of thing. And then we had some discussion about what's changed in our industrial district. What kind of land uses make sense to keep there? What things maybe really need to be in a heavier commercial district, things like that. So we kind of went through and looked at that. And we also came up with a kind of new spin on your R3 residential zoning district, which does not exist on your zoning maps today. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear was the need for more variety of housing and types of housing here. When we had a focus group with your realtors, we heard that they have waiting lists of people who want things like townhomes and duplexes and stuff, but there aren't enough in the community. So we're trying to come up with a district here that will accommodate some of what we call missing middle housing, what's between the apartment complex and the single family home. So those are all some of the things we looked at as we were working on these key zoning issues. Next, we also looked at the subdivision side of things, the subdivision plats. So again, from the comprehensive plan, there were certain areas that were called out in the community that were suitable for development. And so we want to align with those areas to make sure growth happens and it makes sense there. We also want to, besides the new growth and places where that can be supported with infrastructure, we also wanted to, again, look at the opportunities you have for infill and redevelopment in this community, which is big. You've already got utilities in place in these neighborhoods or areas. You've got roads in place. You've got the infrastructure to support it. So let's go ahead and make it so it can be redeveloped, or so you can get more infill on vacant lots and things like that. And again, I've already talked about the green infrastructure for stormwater management. Also just clarifying how things are dedicated. Here we're talking about right-of-way to the city particularly. And then one of the big things which is happening now and is starring your city engineer Ron May is the new engineering design manual. And that goes hand in hand with the subdivision ordinance regulations, so that when developers build or redevelop, they have standards in place that they follow from this manual that support the ordinance standards. And you end up with the kind of development and investment in infrastructure that will last in the community. So that's something that kind of, again, it's not part of the ordinance, but there's a lot of coordination. We've been in contact with the team, the consulting team that's working on that with Ron, and are spending a lot of time talking to him about the parts of the ordinance that are impacted by that. Okay, we also, as we transition to this new ordinance, we know it's different and we know it's new. And so, again, part of our goal was to make sure that what we were doing was transparent, that everybody in the community knew what was happening, and that we're coming up with something that makes development predictable or consistent. So if you go to the Plan Commission and you meet all the standards in this new ordinance for a subdivision plat, you know you're going to be approved. It just makes it so that there is some confidence there. The role of the Council Plan Commission and BZA is going to be important as we go through this transition. How many of you did the training session that I did for the community? Some of you did, I know, I recognize some of your faces. So you all that are on the Plan Commission, the BCA, the City Council, will be using this Unified Development Ordinance as a resource all the time at your meetings. When you're looking at a rezoning, one of the criteria from Indiana state law is whether this change of zoning is going to be happening at the right time, whether the support infrastructure and so forth are in place. So there'll be considerations like that that you're going to have to look to the ordinance and say, are they meeting the standards in here? Does this make sense? If you're on the BCA, you're going to be using it when you evaluate variances or other cases before you to make sure they make sense in that location. So this will be a go-to thing that you look at. And it will be something that, again, it's going to be different, but hopefully we've designed it so it's going to be easy to get through and you can find things a little bit easier than before. One of the things that I do want to tell you, though, is that we can't do this and then wait 10 years or more before we do any changes or updates to it. Laws change, land uses change, practices change. So you do have to look at it regularly and make amendments or make adjustments. And it's kind of like I say, you know, how many of us go to the doctor for our annual physical? Oh, come on, you guys are healthier than that. Okay, thank you. It's kind of the same thing. You kind of need to do a somewhat regular checkup of your ordinance and your comprehensive plan and just say what's changed. You know, do we have a new law that changed, or do we have something where we have all kinds of variants? Who are my BCA members? Yeah. Is this something where we granted half a dozen variances this year? Do we need to go back and look at this section of the ordinance? So you need to kind of do a regular checkup and see what might need to change because of that. And then to make it easier to transition to, we decided that starting with January 1st, 2024 would give everybody time to get used to it. We would make it a nice, clean start date, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So we'd be adopting it later this fall, but then there'd be a waiting period, if you will, where everybody can kind of get up to speed on it. And then that's kind of where we are with that transition as far as the timing. And then if you look at this combined zoning and subdivision ordinance, which is called what's UDO stand for? Unified Development Ordinance, right? This is how we have set up the chapters right now. So the first chapter, the introductory provisions, are kind of the legal setup for this whole thing. Not the most exciting chapter in there maybe, but important. The second one is where we start to get into the meat of it with all the zoning districts, including the new stuff for R3 that we were talking about. So here's where it'll say what you can do in each zoning district and what the setbacks are and what the maximum heights are and so forth in each zoning district. 3 gets into site development standards. That's where you're going to find standards for things like how much parking do I need? What kind of signage can I put up? Are there landscaping requirements or buffers between certain uses? That's all in there in the site development standards. Use standards will be standards for some uses that maybe need a little more direction or consideration. Chapter 5, we have design regulations for subdivisions. The state leaves it up to every community to come up with their own ordinance standards. So your design standards for subdivisions may not be the same as your neighbors or the counties or Columbus or other Rushville or Edinburgh or other places. Then we have a couple chapters that are really important, which are the subdivision administration and the zoning administration. That's where we spell out the processes for every kind of thing that happens. So if you want to have a subdivision approved, the subdivision administration chapter will actually have a flow chart that that shows you the steps you go through. If you want to do a variance, the zoning administration chapter will have a flow chart that shows you the steps that you go through for that. So it spells out in detail what those steps are. Very important is chapter 8, which is nonconformities. That's a chapter that tells us what do we do with things that were legally created but don't meet these new standards. So this is part of that transition. And the short answer is, as long as something was legally created, it can continue to be. If they want to change it, they can change it a certain amount without having to come into compliance with new standards. But that's all spelled out in detail in this ordinance, and that's going to be something very important to consider. Enforcement and remedies. This is kind of the hard part, but there's no point in doing an ordinance and having local laws if you don't enforce them. So this kind of sets up a slightly new way of doing things, a little more streamlined process for enforcement that we patterned after what some other communities are doing. And then number 10, again, maybe not the most exciting thing, but something that's very important is the definitions chapter. It's almost like a dictionary for planning and zoning and subdivisions, where you define each word so that there's no confusion over what it means. All right. So I have talked a lot. Am I on slide 14 yet? Do I talk about this one?
No.
Okay, good. I've talked too much. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague.
No, you talked it just to the right spot.
All right.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, again, my name is David Baird. I'm with American Structure Point. I'm going to talk about a little more of a deep dive into each of these individual chapters that are in the UDO. And we'd like to use this as an opportunity for, please, if you have any questions, just go ahead, raise your hand. We can kind of use this as a Q&A as well, because we're going to kind of think through, if you've got a question about what exactly is in the chapter. The point of going through this is really just to kind of let everyone start thinking about what is going to be in this ordinance. As you can see, or have heard, we've done a good bit of planning, background for that comprehensive plan, and then studies and thinking through and talking with others in the community. So what I'm going to be talking about is laying how this is going to be laid out, how it's going to be rolled out in this ordinance format. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. But
Dave,
yeah.
a quick question on this though. As you're putting this together, before it comes to us in an ordinance form, are we going to be able to have some kind of a cheat sheet that shows, here's the changes from our current zoning ordinance or our current subdivision ordinance compared to what, because this is all new and there's going to be an awful lot here. So I just wonder, as a cheat sheet, because what has changed, right? And so reading through this, it's going to be pretty easy to say, well, maybe I missed that because I didn't realize that piece.
No, you're absolutely right. And one of the things we're considering, let me back up and say what we're doing right now is myself, the team, and Sarah, we're going through with drafts, and we're saying, okay, Sarah's saying maybe we should add some here, maybe we should delete some here based on what we've heard in the past. So once we complete that process, and we're close to completing that process, I'd say we're about 95% through, then at that point, one of the things we've considered doing is exactly what you're discussing, and coming back and having another joint meeting, and we would just literally spell out, here are all the things that have changed from your existing ordinance to yours. So if that is something that everyone would like to see, that's something we have considered. If everyone feels that would be something that would be extremely helpful, we can do that. Does that make sense for everybody? I think that's an approach that I think would be helpful, because there is a lot that is in, I mean, we've talked already about a lot of different issues, so we try to make this as concise as we can, but it is going to be a rather lengthy document. Does anyone have any concerns about that approach? Everyone really like that? Maybe we just literally spell out here the differences as a tool, okay? yeah, so we have a slide about next steps at the end of this, but and I'll repeat it, but I think that's the approach that makes sense for us to do. So, so yeah, that's a great question, and if anyone else has any other questions at this time or any time, just please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll stop where I'm at, and we can circle back around this. So thank you for that. Yeah, that was good. So yeah, going into that first chapter, as KK said, this is very much lays out, okay, where does this apply? What's the purpose of this? What are we doing? The very intro type things. It's not something that you use as a regulation on a daily basis. So next. The zoning districts, this lists out all the districts, and it'll have what land uses are permitted in each district and which land uses would not be available in the district, and then what would be permitted with what we call additional standards. So, as you brought up changes, as we look at this today, you've got the R3 district that does exist today, but there's nothing that is actually zoned towards it. So KK made reference to that. So we've looked at some ways that maybe we can incentivize that for potentially someone who may want to use that in the future. The other couple districts, the neighborhood business district, this is a really good one that shows how this came out from the comp plan process and the process that KK went through. Is that what we, and I can see it just driving into town, is you've got some true residential districts and some true commercial districts. And there's a pretty hard stop between the two. So, you know, what about that person that's right on the edge of the commercial district and maybe wants to put in some little small shop? You know, right now you don't have that availability to do that. That's something that we heard that maybe didn't be good for this community, so that allows for that option. The other district that's new is the institutional district. That would be if you have maybe a large new employer that came in, that would be something that we believe that would be helpful, is potentially bringing that in. So next district, or excuse me, not district, next slide. So I kind of went through this a little bit, but in that chapter 2, again, it'll say what land uses are permitted, what we call additional standards, and then what we call development standards as well. And those are what the maximum height would be, your setbacks, the stormwater concerns that we heard, a regulation that is not in your ordinances today, but is something that a lot of jurisdictions are looking at to make sure that there's enough pervious cover, is on new development, having a max that could be paved. That, you know, there's only so large of a pipe that you can have before you start having an accumulation of problems. So there are things you can do on the site that reduce that burden that's put on the city. Next slide. So the site development standards, those are standards that apply to all land uses unless specifically stated. Some of the things that we've been drafting on, and this is one of the chapters we're really in the heart of working through with Sarah right now, is your accessory structures, your what we call architectural standards, parking standards. Parking standards is one area that we see in this community and other communities where we can decrease the standard, because there's not really as much of a need for parking maybe as there was many years ago. We talked about reducing that water overflow. We talked about shared parking. That's one of the provisions we have in. Where we see these large parking lots that have they have 4 different stores. They don't really need all that parking that's there, and it just ends up as a unused paved space. So that's an example of where the requirement has gone down. That we believe will be helpful for your development community as well. Landscaping requirements, lighting, lots and setbacks. I won't go through all of them, but the sign ordinance, we understand that's an important area. So we're making sure that we tweak this and make sure that it's custom fit for Greensburg. This is, I often get the question, what is a good standard, what's a bad standard? My response to that is, well, what's the right standard for your community? What is the right standard for Greensburg? It's so different than like a building code or in an engineering thing, situation where, you know, it's either built properly or built poorly. But with these zoning regulations, it's really what fits your community enough to attract development and then also keep out things that you might not want to have right next to you. So next. So on the use standards, these are those things that KK mentioned that you need little additional standards with. These are the ones we have in today. These are some of the things that where we draft. Now, I will say on this is one of the chapters we're still kind of working through. These are uses that will have some additional standards to them, but there may be additional ones. Some of the ones I want to mention, KK brought up about the ordinance needing to be amended and new land uses. In the year 2000, 20 years ago, if you would have told people what does short-term rental mean, probably not many people would have known exactly what that was. Today I say that in a room and everyone knows that's Airbnb. I know what that is. So that's one where we have some regulations in, and also home businesses. I understand that's been an issue here locally. So we want to make sure that for someone who wants to do a small business that's not intrusive, that they can do that. They can come to Sarah. But if it's a larger issue, then that would be something that maybe needs to be done in a commercial district. Next. Subdivision design. Of course, we're working with your city engineer to get this tailored. These are kind of the list of the things that goes into it. I'll tell you that the streets and alleys, that very much is tied into your engineering design manual, so it's really a great time to be doing these two in concert. I work with a lot of communities that where they've maybe done, where I come in and I'm just now starting to do an ordinance for the land use portion, and I read and I see that the design manual does not talk to or does not link together with that ordinance. So we're going to make sure those two are what I like to call talking to each other, that they're properly cross-referenced. So next. Before I get into the administrative part, this is a good stopping spot. Does anyone have any questions on the standards? Any questions about what you would see or wouldn't see? Okay. So the administration, these are the list of those specific things. Again, I won't go through all of them, but a lot of these are standard for Indiana. They're very straightforward. But one of the ones you have that works well and we want to make sure is still in your existing ordinance is the administrative plat. So we're going to make sure that all those are in and that it complies with state law. So these are kind of the documents, how you have to submit things. There's some things today, right now in the ordinance that aren't clear about how you have to submit. So we want to clarify that. We want to make it very straightforward for you. So zoning administration, all the bodies that are here today, making it clear what your role is. Next. And then what the role of Sarah can be. One of the things we always do, and this is true here, is that there's some things that you're comfortable with, that you as a city council, you as a planning commissioner are comfortable with. Well, if you're comfortable with that, we might as well allow that to be administratively approved. I will say the technical review committee that was on the last slide, what that basically speaks to is your group of staff, not just your larger main administrator. That's your city engineer. Those are other people that are reviewing the document. Non-conformities. KK did a good job of kind of going through that. That'll spell out how to deal with those issues. Enforcement, very much the same way. There are some very state laws that we've got to adhere to, so we've got to make sure of that. And then the definitions and rules of interpretation. One thing that is very critical that, and you're not alone, but it is very difficult to deal with in your existing ordinances is your land uses are not defined. And that becomes very problematic from a staff perspective. I have, as many of the people here, I've been in Sarah's position, and it can be very, very difficult when something is kind of gray and you don't have a definition. So that was always my biggest frustration for people who were applicants. It was hard for them to kind of see that. But when we define that, you know, it makes it so much easier. I remember when I was working in the public sector, I had a planning commissioner one time that said, well, what exactly does it mean by this land use or the term? What does it exactly mean by general business? There's no definition. I can't really tell you. So we want to make sure that's defined so that does not continue to be a problem. So next. So I was talking about the timeline. Myself, Phil, and Sarah are going to meet tomorrow. We're going to kind of review where we are today, make sure it can align with everyone's calendars. But what we're looking at is as quickly as we can get a full draft out, we're going to do that. That'll be for the whole code. And then that will give probably about a week and a half for you guys to review it. And then we would come back and we would do just what you're suggesting, which is have another presentation to go through. Here's how it's changed. What are your concerns? What are you comfortable with this, or would you like it to be modified? We could discuss those things that maybe could be debatable as to how we want to end up. So that's generally our thoughts. We are going to meet in the morning and think through the specifics of that. But like I said, we're about, I'd say about 95% through the drafting phase. So I would love to give you an exact date and time as to when we will be able to release everything, but I don't want to do that just in case we get in and notice, oh, we need to tweak this a little bit more, or we need to, you know, add or delete this kind of thing. So, but that's generally where we're at. And then we'd be looking for potential adoption for this in October. So with that, any other questions that you guys may have?
Yeah. You mentioned the engineering design manual as well. Is that going to, will those come out together, or that later?
Well, I'll let Ron talk about the specifics on that. I could answer generally, but he'll have a much better specific answer.
Jamie, we're working with our consultant to develop updated design standards for the city that are intended to be applicable across the board, not just for new development, but for every activity the city's involved with, or people wanting to do business with the city are involved with. That process went under contract a month ago and is anticipated to be completed by the end of the year. One of the objectives of that work is to, first off, not include it specifically in the ordinance, but include it in the ordinance by reference. This will allow us a little more ease in updating it as criteria change, but we're also trying to develop standards that rely on what's commonly referred to as industry standards, using things like NDOT design manual where applicable, using things like the American Water Works Association or the 10 state standards that are industry recognized criteria. And then we won't be in the situation of trying to keep those current, because these bigger, more focused organizations will be doing that. So the goal is to have that done by the end of the year as this ordinance is coming online. I might also mention, you all heard a new stormwater ordinance on first reading in your stormwater requirements for the city. And this is a part of a lot of other things that are going on, the updates to the MS4 requirements, new requirements from IDEM for stormwater management. And so it will be a third companion document, which will be both the new ordinance for stormwater and then design technical standards for stormwater specifically.
So to
That's all
kind of
effective.
further,
January
I
1st.
think maybe try to help answer your question as well is, so our task is anytime it needs to be referenced to the design manual, we've put a section that says, see engineering design manual. So if it occurs that we can put a specific cross-reference there before, if it gets a draft done, then we can add those specific cross-references. But as we're drafting it today, where every time it needs to refer to it, we're just saying see this section. So I think, or see the design manual. My guess is that our process will be finished drafted before they will have finished drafted based on the timeline. But